Hello? Okay, there we are. For some reason it wasn't working. So, welcome crew. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high. Get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. We are live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. So it is Sunday, October 10th, Monday, October 11th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I hope you had an awesome weekend so far, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on one of our many outlets. If you're listening to us live right now, you're listening to us on Spreaker.com, and that's where we have our chat room for the evening if you have any questions or just want to hang out and make convo with the other listeners. And you can also find us on KPNL Radio, which you can find at kpnl-db.com. You may also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podcast Chaser. Make sure you follow and like us and flick that little bell there on YouTube under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and pretty soon StreamYard. I keep saying that. Things just keep going crazy. I mean, it's one thing after another. Right now, it's my car overheated as I was going into town to get brand new tires on it, and then made it back home after getting the new tires, and I haven't driven it since because the radiator went out. There was a connector that the previous owner had rigged, and so, yeah, I believe I need a water pump on my Subaru. Yeah, that's one of the things that's been keeping me on my toes. So tonight, we were supposed to be doing UFOs and Us with Mr. Jeremy Catan, but unfortunately, he has come down with a case of the flu. So, we're going to do story time with me, your hostess with the mostest, TessaTNT. We got Mr. Champ in the chat room. Hey, Champ. Good to see you. Last night in the after party, he actually forgot to turn his camera back on, so I don't think we knew he was there. So the call ended early, and we all went to bed at somewhat of a reasonable hour. I like to stay up and watch videos and listen to music and post stuff post haste. Alright, so the book that we will be reading from, and hopefully the sound is better tonight. I think I got it fixed. If I sound garbly or whatever, let me know, Nick, because I don't want it to be a horrible listening experience. I hate when you're trying to listen and you can't hear what exactly is being said because it's just... So the book we are reading from this evening is 50 Strange Stories of the Real... Supernatural, 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, True Accounts of Weird and Other-Worldly Happenings. And this is a book of true accounts of weird and otherworldly incidents by Michael Blee, Douglas Collier, Patrick Dugan, Andrew Ewart, Ian Fellows Gordon, Michael and Molly Hardwick, Dottie Hay, Charles Eric Main, Ronald Seth, Claire Smythe, Rosemary Timperley, James Wentworth Day, and Loris Wilson. So I believe we left off on the chapter that was called They Came Back. Oh. We actually made it to Of Saints and a Church. We got into a story, so, man, I wonder if I should just restart this because the last story time was messed up as far as what channel I chose on Spreaker. For some reason they have about 5 or 6 different channels that you can use, and unfortunately the channel that I did use was the garbly underwater sounding connection. Like anybody needs that. Well, I'm not hearing anything there in the chat, so perhaps it's all right. I don't know. And since I'll be reading tonight, I'm not going to be really typing a lot. So that's why I said hello to Champ on the airwaves as opposed to in chat. But yeah, feel free to come on over in the chat room, Spreaker.com. It's really easy to make an account and get an account up and running for this, but it's really cool just to hang out with cool, like-minded people. Sometimes we get a wild card in there, here and there. Sometimes that makes it funner, and sometimes it's a real pain in the bootay. Just gonna grab a drink of water here really quick. Wet the whistle, so to speak. Alrighty. Just make sure you guys grab your pillows, your woobies, your blankets. Put on a toque if you need it. It's getting chilly out there these days. Fall is here and winter is upon us. And Halloween is coming up. Okay, so for Halloween, I would like to do like a on-air Halloween like costume party where we sit around and tell different ghost stories or whatnot. If you're nervous on the air and you're afraid to talk, you could put your story in the chat room and I'll read it for you. But I thought that would be fun. If I don't get enough people that want to do it, I might just do some sort of pre-record and go out and do Halloween with the kids and then do an after party. I'm not sure yet. But I'd really like to be on air with you guys because that's my job. You know, this is our place. This is where we hang out on the weekends. I wonder if Halloween's going to be on a Monday next year. I have to look at that. Alrighty, so here we go. Stigmata. Christianity, for a religion, is nonviolent in its essence, is remarkably blood-drenched in its evocations. Sadism is unthinkable, and masochism is unbridled. The immediate result of the birth of Christ was the massacre of the innocents. Thus, bloodshed early became established as the accompaniment for his life and for those of his followers for generations to come. The divine footsteps proved a bloody trail, and while preaching his gospel of peace, Christ continuously spoke of blood, the blood of man. This is my blood that will be shed for you. Finally, he was subjected to the most appalling suffering and bloody death, leaving the legacy, "Take up your cross and follow me." The early Christians did not have long to wait. The bloodbath of suffering and persecution soon began and continued throughout the first centuries of the Christian church. There emerged that most venerate being, the martyr. Martyrdom became not just a fate to be borne with resignation when inevitable, but one to be actually sought out. Thousands went happily to unspeakable deaths, when often simple prudence would have sufficed to weather the storm. Times changed, and for reasons sometimes humanitarian, sometimes political, martyrdom became a glory not so easily attained. Not so easily attained for Christians, that is. For alas, as the Christian church and its people formed the status quo in Europe, they saw to it that many a follower of other spiritual leaders were given the opportunity of a martyr's death. During the Middle Ages, Christians, for the most part, were free of suffering inflicted on them by others, but did not lose the notion that Christians should suffer simply because they were Christians. The tradition of self-imposed suffering was continued. Suffering by fasting, by flagellation, by acts of humility, by self-mortification, and by resignation to affliction. Some practices encouraged fell little, if at all, short of the bizarre. Not a few were given to kissing the sores of lepers, edifying no doubt for the aspiring saint, but a practice which must have been somewhat startling for the unfortunate leper. Religious writers were prolific, and discussion of religious matters was popular. During the 12th century, among the points debated were the words of St. Paul, "I bear the marks of the Lord Jesus in my body," and that's Galatians 6:17. It was held by some that the saint had meant these words literally. Also, it was rumored that some Christian mystics had become so absorbed in contemplation upon the passion of Christ that they felt physical pain and bore marks corresponding to his wounds. Then, in 1224, a wonder occurred in the Christian world. Rumor became fact. Francis of Assisi, the founder of an order of friars, had a vision. When the vision faded, he bore on his hands and feet and side the marks of the wounds of the crucified Christ. Francis was born in Assisi in 1182. His father was a rich cloth merchant named Piero Bernardone. His mother was Mona Pica, a knight's daughter from Provence. He was christened Giovanni Francesco in the church of San Rufino. He had brothers and sisters, but little is known of them. Francis's childhood was happy, free from want, and unremarkable. As well as his native Italian, he was taught French by his mother. A priest of San Giorgio taught him his alphabet, sums, and a little Latin. He was slow to learn to write, and throughout his life was never at ease with a pen. In early manhood, his father's wealth made it possible for him to indulge in a wayward mode of life common to rich young men at the time. Not all his pursuits were frivolous. In 1202, he joined in the defense of Assisi when it was attacked by the forces of neighboring Perugia. Where is it? Perugia. He was taken prisoner and was held captive for a year, suffering considerable privation. Regaining his freedom, a change came over Francis. He did not immediately forsake his former way of life, but grew increasingly sober-minded and given to spending much time alone. He would disappear for weeks together without explanation. At nearby San Damiano, he came across a small, tumbled-down chapel. A hint of its former glory could be found in the Byzantine crucifix hung over the altar. Splendid art enhancing squalid reality. Francis found his crucifix compelling. For hours he would kneel before it, riveted by the gentleness of the face which had endured so much. One morning, as he knelt at the hour of prime, the sun rose with an unimaginable brilliance. Walls which should have afforded shade were rendered impotent. Francis closed his eyes, but the sun would not be shut out. Just as it seemed that his brain itself would shatter, a voice spoke, "Restore my house." For Francis, there was no doubt that the voice of God had spoken. He restored the chapel of San Damiano. Forsaking his father's wealth, he left home and lived the life of a wandering beggar. When he found a church or chapel lying neglected, he repaired it himself or persuaded others either to help or to donate materials. Soon he had gathered a group of followers, young men also seeking to imitate the life of Christ. Poverty became their ideal. They had no possessions. They lived entirely on charity. What little money they earned from their labors was given to the poor. As their numbers increased and they could be identified as a community, Francis realized that it was necessary to gain papal recognition of their activities. They had started to preach as well as work, and to do the former without papal recognition could result in a charge of heresy. In 1210, accompanied by 11 brothers, Francis traveled to Rome. They were befriended by Cardinal Ugolina, who pleaded their cause with the Pope, Innocent III, and pleading was indeed needed, for Francis declared that they had not come for papal, aka approval. They already had approval from Christ, but for papal recognition. It is astonishing that he should have pulled rank on the Holy Father with this piece of bland self-assurance. However, Innocent was impressed by the obvious sincerity and goodness of the group and granted them permission to preach and form an order, which the world later came to know as the Franciscans. In 1224, 2 years before the death of their founder, the Franciscans and their spiritual sisters, the Poor Clares, were well established. Francis decided to travel to Monteverna to keep what he called Michaelmas Lent, from 15 August, Assumption Day, to 29th of September. He was accompanied by brothers Leo, Angelo, and Maceo. On the southern side of Monteverna, Francis drew apart from the others to a small cave. Brother Leo was to bring the meager rations, a little bread, and some vegetables, and even these not every day. He embarked on a period of fasting, prayer, and contemplation upon the Passion of Christ. At the sunset on 13 September, he left the cave and kept vigil on the side of the mountain. At dawn, on the morning of the 14th, the feast of exaltation of the cross, he turned his face eastwards. The sun rose with San Damiano-like brilliance. Exalted by the moment, he saw a vision of seraph flying towards him. The angel's 6 wings were outspread and shone brighter than the sun. The apparition drew close and hovered above him. He could see that the tips of the seraph's wings were nailed to a cross. Ecstatic, Francis felt his body racked with excruciating pain such as Christ himself must have endured. As the vision faded, As the vision faded, the pain subsided. Francis looked down. His hands bore wounds as though nails had been driven through the palms. His feet were mutilated in the same manner. His left side bore a gash as though a lance had been pierced through it to determine death. The stigmatism of St. Francis is considered to be the first case of its kind, although the notion of such a possibility was not unknown. Certainly, his is the first that was in any way documented. If no one had borne the stigma since, we would wonder if the accounts were not the testimony of well-meaning but overzealous followers. However, Francis was the first of what was to amount to over 300 cases, the latest of whom have died within the last decade. There has always been someone within living memory claiming or at least reputed to bear the stigmata. Dr. Imbert Gorbeyer, whose book on stigmatism was first published in Paris in 1873, gives as 321 the number of known cases. Of these, 41 are men and 280 are women, a staggering proportion of 7 women to 1 man. He gives the geographical distribution as follows: Italy, 229, France, 70, Spain, 33, Germany, 33, Belgium, 15, Portugal, 113, Switzerland, 5, Holland, 5, Hungary, 3, and Peru, 1. The majority of cases, excuse me one second. All right, trying to find my place. So we'll just start here. The proportion of 7 women to 1 man was surely indicate that the emotional constitution of women is more likely to produce the conditions necessary for stigmatism than that of men. Saint Teresa of Avila, herself a stigmatist, constantly warned of the dangers of women dedicated to religious life being prone to hysterical manifestations. She wisely held that if a nun showed signs of losing the run of herself, she should be given some good hard work to take her mind off things. The geographical distribution of the stigmata seems to follow as definite a pattern as the gender of the stigmatists. The figure of 229 for Italy is staggering. Again, the proportion of cases in Italy to cases among other nationalities indicates that there is an emotional climate in Italy conducive to the phenomenon. It should be argued that the Italians are deeply religious people, and it therefore follows that the proportion of those who will reach a sufficient state of sanctity to be rewarded with the stigmata will be high. This may well be, but it is interesting to note that the Irish, who are also a deeply religious people, cannot boast of a single case of stigmatism. Indeed, since the 5th century, there is almost total lack of religiously associated phenomena in Ireland. There is, however, in Ireland a vast history of allegedly supernatural phenomenon, but these tend to be associated with what one might call the spirit world in general rather than with God or his saints. This may be because the Irish were well immersed in the belief in a spirit world long before the coming of Christianity. Therefore, perhaps, their mystical manifestations tend not to be Christian in nature. I would suggest that countries like Italy, France, Spain, and Germany, which have all produced many stigmatists, have a mystical climate firmly allied to Christianity. This is, of course, not to say that they had none before the coming of Christianity, but rather that Christianity was the mainstream of the evolution of their mystical beliefs. Hence, their mystical phenomena tend to be Christian-oriented and orientated. Art may also have some bearing on the geographical positioning of stigmatists. Italy, France, Spain, and Germany have a long tradition of religious paintings and sculptures, many portraying the crucifixion in romantic but lurid detail. These must surely be encouraged and aided deep contemplation of the event. Ireland is totally lacking in any tradition of such paintings. Early Celtic Christian representations are symbolic, not material to a susceptible imagination. Imagination plays an important part in the phenomena. Many persons who have borne the stigmata have had a previous history of nervous disorder. Stigmata are strictly connected with ecstasy, which psychologically is an emotional state. There has been no case where they have occurred independently of ecstasy. For a well-documented and modern case of ecstasy run riot, we need look no further than the case of Teresa Newman. Teresa Newman's life was pious almost from the start. The official records give her date of birth as 9 April 1898. The Newmans lived in the small Bavarian village of Kornersruth, close to the Czechoslovakian border. They earned their living partly by farming a few acres and partly by tailoring. The 10 children, of whom Teresa was the eldest, were given a Christian upbringing, being taught to love and adhere to the Roman Catholic faith. The family home was not a luxurious one, but its inhabitants never knew want. Teresa could be a nervous and irritable child and had frequent attacks of vertigo. Nothing particularly strange in all that. A hint of what was to come could have been found in her unusual devotion to the Passion of Christ. She would weep bitterly at being told about it or reading of it. In 1912, when she was 14, she was employed as a servant by a wealthy neighbor. She was an industrious girl and did not shrink from hard work. On 10 March 1918, a fire broke out in a nearby farm. Teresa ran to help. The sight of the fire gave her a severe traumatic shock, but she managed to help control the fire with buckets of water and even later fed the animals in her employer's stable without changing her wet clothes. It was from this date that Teresa Newman's long history of illness and afflictions began. She suffered extreme pain in her back, had agonizing spasms from the slightest cause, and could eat hardly anything without experiencing severe vomiting. Her sight deteriorated, causing her to fall often, each fall intensifying the pains in her head and eyes. From October 1918, she was bedridden. On 17 May 1919, she had a long attack of convulsions, which she emerged totally blind. Towards the end of 1922, she heard of a student of theology who suffered from an ailment of the throat, as a result of which he was in danger of being dismissed from the seminary. Teresa, as though she didn't have enough troubles of her own, prayed to God that she might suffer in place of the student. Soon after, she experienced a similar ailment in her throat. She felt as if her throat had been wounded and would sometimes spit blood when coughing. Swallowing became so painful that her sole nourishment was reduced to a few teaspoonfuls of a gruel or barley mash. Teresa had a great devotion to Therese of Lisieux, the day on which the future saint was proclaimed and blessed in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was 29 April 1923. That morning, Teresa Newman opened her eyes and could see for the first time in 4 years. But though her sight was restored, her many other sufferings were increased in number. Abscesses, ulcers, appendicitis, paralysis of the legs, paralysis of the spine, pneumonia, festering wounds of the legs, and the awful list reached almost comic proportions. In 1925, at midnight on 30 September, the anniversary of the death of St. Therese of Lisieux, Teresa had a vision of a light. From out this light a voice told her, "Your external suffering will cease, but you must undergo another suffering more cruel." The next day, Teresa rose from her bed and went to church unaided. The suffering more cruel was not made manifest till the Lent of 1926. On 4 March, while resting in bed, Teresa suddenly had a vision of Christ in the Garden of Olives. She could see the 3 apostles in the background. Jesus was suffering the agony in the garden. As she gazed with emotion at the suffering of Christ, Teresa felt a pain in her left side. Something warm trickled down her body. It was blood. The following Thursday night, Teresa witnessed the same scene. Early on the Friday morning, she saw a vision of the scourging at the pillar. Again, the wound in her side bled. The 3rd week, she saw a crowning with thorns. The 4th, she saw the journey to Calvary. On the 5th week, on the night of Holy Thursday and Good Friday, she witnessed the entire Passion. She emerged from this ecstasy bearing wounds on her feet and hands. Teresa Newman bore the stigmata till her death in 1962. Every Friday, in ecstasy, she witnessed again the Passion of Christ. Each week, it was as though she was watching the scenes unfold for the first time. To her, the events were not historic or familiar, but immediate and unknown. So much so that for her reactions to the various incidents, it was evident that she thought Christ would be rescued by the apostles before he died. In time, the wounds on her hands and feet ceased to bleed, while those on her head and side continued to bleed during the Friday ecstasies. Another amazing aspect of her extraordinary story is that from September 1927, Teresa allegedly fasted permanently. It is claimed that not so much as a drop of water passed her lips, let alone food. Teresa Newman's stigmatism is an insistence among many of the phenomenon occurring against a background of physical ailments and emotional disturbance, phenomenal in themselves. Padre Pio of Foggia, a Capuchin friar, is an example of the stigmata in a more serene setting. Francesco Forgione was born in Pietrelcina, southern Italy, on 25 May 1887. His parents, Orazio and Maria, were poor. They lived by farming a small plot of land. They had 4 children in all. It was Orazio's ambition to save enough money to immigrate to America. It was not his plan to take the family with him, but to earn money to send home for his children's education. Francesco had a deep love of his father, and it is reasonable to assume that the constant talk of the father going away had an unsettling effect upon the children. He also had an unusual compassion for suffering of others. He had many opportunities to exercise this sensibility, for life was very hard in Pietrelcina. At its best, it was a pitiful existence. Winter flooding often caused misery and death. The local priest, Don Salvatore Perullo, took an interest in the boy, no doubt recognizing a gentler spirit than the harshness of life in Pietrelcina would tolerate. It is said that Francesco would often play with twigs, forming them into the shape of a cross. In view of his later history, this may have been recalled by people who gave it more significance than it warranted at the time. Where religion plays a large part in the lives of people, many children will imitate what they see in church. However, it is obvious that the young Francesco had an awareness of sorrow which bordered on the morose. In 1894, Orazio at last went to America. This may have made the family emotionally poorer, but in terms of physical comfort, it made them very much less poor. The money Orazio sent from America greatly improved their lot. Next to the Forgione farmhouse, there stood a small hut. Francesco formed the habit of going into it to play after his father had left for America. In time, he even slept in the hut and spent long hours in contemplation. It was no surprise to anyone that when asked what he would become when he grew up, he answered, a monk. In 1902, Francesco left his home and journeyed to Morocco to become a novice in the monastery there. The work of a novice in the monastery was laborious. Francesco worked by day and prayed long into the night. His health deteriorated. However, on 22 January 1903, he received the brown habit of the Brothers of St. Francis. As his name in religion, he chose Frate Pio, in honor of the patron saint of Pietrelcina, Saint Pio. Frate Pio's health did not improve. His almost frenzied praying increased, and, to the alarm of his superiors, he fasted for 21 days. The guardian brother, Father Agostino, sent for the doctor, who advised that Fray Pio be sent home. Orazio happened to be home on a visit from America at this time, and one can imagine the bewilderment that he and Maria must have felt when they learned that their son was being sent home from the monastery. But the young novice regained his health and returned to the monastery. Shortly after this, he was transferred to the monastery at St. Elia in Pianesi. Soon he fell ill again and was sent to the monastery of Verafro. In spite of his ill health, he fasted, prayed, and endured periods of penance. Again, he was sent home. One cannot help feeling that it was with a sense of relief that each superior saw Fray Pio on his way. Ascetics are all very fine, but they can have a devastatingly disruptive effect on a community's life. St. Catherine of Siena fell into a trance during Mass said by Blessed Raymond of Capua. He wrote of the incident later, "My disciples and I were waiting impatiently for her to come to herself." St. Catherine, along with St. Teresa of Avila, were cases of invisible stigmatists. They felt pain, but no wounds appeared. St. Teresa claimed to feel that her heart was pierced with a lance, and indeed, after her death, an autopsy disclosed a scar on her heart. On 17 September 1915, Padre Pio, he was ordained priest in August 1910, received the invisible stigmata. In the intervening year, he was back and forth between monastery and home according to the constant variations in his health. It was during one of his sojourns at home that he received the invisible stigmata in his hands. He still prayed in the little hut he had used when a boy. His mother went to call him for the midday meal. She found him with his face contoured with pain. Frightened, she ran for the priest, Don Salvatore. When they reached the hut, they found Padre Pio calm and composed, but his face wet with tears. He explained that his hands had been burning in the palms. In March 1918, Padre Pio was sent to the monastery of St. Mary of the Graces in San Giovanni Rotondo, near Foggia. His life there was somewhat calmer than before. Including him, the community numbered only 7. Among the local people, he gained the reputation of being a man of great piety and understanding. The small church would be packed for his Mass, and long queues formed outside with confessional. On the night of 20 September 1918, the friars were startled to hear Padre Pio let out a cry of pain. They rushed to his cell and found him lying on the floor just outside it. He was in a pool of blood. As yet not knowing what had happened, they moved him with extreme care. They soon found the sources of the blood. Padre Pio was bleeding from wounds in his hands, feet, and the left side just below the heart. He bore the stigmata for the rest of his life. His wounds bleeding every time he said Mass, he died on 23 September 1968. His case is unusual in that he was the only man since St. Francis of Assisi to bear the 5 wounds of Christ. Other male stigmatists have always borne only a partial stigmata. The stigmata of Padre Pio was investigated by the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office. In 1923, it published its findings. It declared that after due investigations, the happenings associated with Padre Pio had not been proved to be supernatural in origin. It further exhorted the faith to maintain an attitude towards them accordingly. The Holy Office was not making any implications against the integrity of Padre Pio in its declaration. It was merely stating a fact, albeit a negative one, not proven. It was, however, in its verdict, recognizing that the phenomenon could conceivably have had a natural cause arising from the pathological condition of the bearer. We have already noted that most stigmatists have had a history of nervous disorders. Another factor common to them is that, with few exceptions, they have all been Roman Catholics. A strange exception occurred in Germany in 1935. Arthur Otto Muck, a timber merchant in Hamburg, was involved in an automobile accident in May 1928. 7 years later, the wounds of the crown of thorns appeared on his head, shortly to be followed by stigmata on the hands, feet, and side. The phenomena had no apparent religious significance for Muck, had no particular devotion to Christ, and, moreover, considered his stigmatism an intolerable nuisance. He is also singular among his fellow sufferers in Europe in being a Protestant. Stigmatism has also been recorded among Muslim ascetics. They have borne wounds corresponding to those borne by Mohammed. The stigmata present no problems to those who believe in the possibility of divine intervention. For those who believe that the phenomenon must have a natural cause, the problem is unsolved as yet. But not perhaps unsolvable. It may be possible that the explanation lies somewhere between the two. When the woman was cured by touching the hem of Christ's garment, he said to her, "Thy faith has made thee whole." He did not say, "Because of thy faith I have made thee whole," suggesting, I think, that the woman's mind had played a very large part in the phenomenon. Are the stigmata this miracle in reverse? Does the intense wish of the stigmatists to share in the passion of Christ provide the faith to make themselves infirm? Here we have the next story, known as The Burnt Bible of Broad Hinton. It has been rightly said that Wiltshire is one of the loneliest countries in England. In the north is industrial and not very attractive Swindon, and down in the south is beautiful Salisbury, with its inspired cathedral, but in between lies a large, sparsely populated territory strewn with monuments such as Stonehenge, Avebury, which have betokened its association with ancient history. The roads and railways are scarce, the villages few and far between. The land seems to brood still upon time long past. If you take the narrow road leading northwest across the rolling downs from Marlborough, if you travel some 6 miles, you will reach the lovely little village of Broad Hinton. This appears, like so many Wiltshire villages, to have sprung up in the middle of nowhere, but it is in fact not more than 8 miles south of the bustling complex of Swindon. There is a fine and ancient church at Broad Hinton, but perhaps its most memorable feature is the most macabre of any village church in Britain. Saints have been butchered in cathedrals, indeed sizable battles have been fought inside Scottish ones, But the ordinary English village church has its quiet religious festivals, its christenings, its marriages, its funerals, with little more than the very occasional drama of someone objecting loudly after the banns for a marriage have been called that, yes, he considers there is a just cause and impediment, which would make the marriage a sin. So, for most villages, like Broadhinton, this sort of drama is about the only outward happening which takes place in church. But inside the ancient church of that village, there is a statue. This in itself is unusual, for although there are brasses to rub flat the floor, there are not many statues to stare at in wonder. Yeah, I think I skipped a line there. For although there are brasses to rub, flat brass representations of great and saintly men and women set into the floor, there are not many statues to stare at and wonder. There we go. Now we're on track. The statue of Sir Thomas Rotten is one of these. It was worn the ravages of time since the 16th century remarkably well, and one realizes straightway that his hideous deformity was with him in life and has been carefully and accurately depicted. For Sir Thomas has no hands. In every other way, he seems a fine, upstanding fellow, but where his hands should be are only a pair of stumps. Behind the sculpture is a story, a weird and strange story, which accounts for the gallant knight's deformity. And if you ask, you will be permitted to see the other surviving half of the tale, a large and badly burnt Bible. Did the good man rescue the book from some fire, and in so doing have his hands burnt off? This seems the most logical explanation, and if true, it makes Sir Thomas a very brave man indeed. Or did Satan himself strike with fire as Sir Thomas was reading the good book and burn both the book and reader? Neither explanation would be correct, and the parish records tell an unlikely but true story of what actually did happen. Sir Thomas was highly respected, if a little feared, during those early 1500s when he was living. He was an absolutely intrepid hunter who would charge a 12-pointer stag at bay, sometimes as many as 3 wolves at a time, rather than have them cripple his precious steed. As for men, it was rumored that he had killed upwards of 100 of these in personal combat. One reason for this personal combat to the death, so indulged in during the Middle Ages, may have been Sir Thomas Rotten's hot temper. He was renowned, admired, despised, and feared because of this, and no two people in the neighborhood seemed to share an opinion about him. Today, we would probably call him a bully, but a bully with courage and with a heart of gold, for there are instances of his having shown great kindness to men and women in trouble. As is so often the case, the bully meets and marries someone he can bully to his heart's content. A pretty young lady from distant parts, perhaps as much as 50 miles away, who succumbed to his charms, was a quiet, home-loving, and deeply religious person who was never known to raise her voice. She reared him 4 fine children, only to have her own devotion coupled with her husband's vile temper turn them into 4 cripples. This is how it happened, and deeply religious men and women of Broadhinton will tell you the story with a shudder. It had been a cold and wintry day, that 16th day of January, 1541, but Sir Thomas indulged his passion for hunting. Rumor had it that if he failed to encounter stag, wolf, fox, or even hare, he would run through the first peasant he came upon during the homeward ride. Today he had been successful, and a great stag lay draped across the forepart of his horse. He was pleased with himself. and at the same time pleasurably anticipating the meal his wife would have prepared. Not for Sir Thomas, some scullion in the nether regions prepared food for the family. He wanted his wife's cooking, and however much she might have preferred to read or work at her tapestry, the onus was on her to cook all meals for the 6 members of the family and have them ready on time. Ready on time. So it was quite unreasonable, just because Sir Thomas got back early from his hunt and happened to be very hungry, for him to expect a meal ready or even cooking. It was 2 hours before the meal was due. He clumped his way into the big central room where the cooking was done in one corner, over an immense fire, and saw to his annoyance that no one was there. Nothing was cooking. Cursing, he went up to the fire and saw that a great haunch of venison had been set out on a stone slab, waiting to be spitted. There were vegetables too, but nothing, so far, was being prepared. Then his eyes got used to the comparative darkness of the big room with its tiny windows and a few tallow candles flickering in the draught, and he noticed, as he should have done before, that Lady Rotten was sitting some distance from the great fire, and that she was reading by the light of one of the candles. "Well, woman," he roared, "where's my fare? Where is our meal?" She carefully put down the book on the stone floor beside her and smiled the sweet, innocent smile for which she was well known and loved. "But, Thomas, it is 2 full hours before the mealtime." "Nonsense, you lie, and my stomach never does. My belly tells me it is mealtime, and yet here you sit, not even beginning to prepare my food." "Had you told me, Thomas, that you wanted food early, I would have prepared it, but you did not, and the children are out, expecting to come back and find their meal ready too, but in another 2 hours, at 6 of the clock. I was about to begin, and I will do so now, but I much fear it will take both those 2 hours for the venison to cook thoroughly and the vegetables to be ready. You dislike your meat half raw. Curse you, woman. My belly screams for food. Prepare it now, I say, prepare it now." "Very well, then." Lady Rotten got up patiently and went over to the stone table where the raw venison was lying. "And what the devil's the book you've been reading when you should have been performing your wifely duties?" "Don't use that language, Thomas. Least of all about that book. It is the holy book, and I think it might do you no harm to read a few pages of it, every now and then." "What? You make such a suggestion to me, as if I were some erring child?" "Yes, Thomas, I do." "By God, woman, I'll show you." And with one bound, the lithe hunter was across into the shadows where his wife had been reading. His strong hands seized the big family Bible, raised it above his head like an executioner brandishing his axe, and hurled it straight into the huge fireplace, where 6-foot logs were burning brightly. His wife screamed, "Keep quiet. Perhaps that will teach you to prepare a meal for an honest man." You blasphemous fool!" Lady Rotten knelt down and plunged both hands deep into the fire, right to the elbow and beyond. It was perhaps 6 feet from the front of the fireplace to the back, and rather more than that from side to side, and good Sir Tom had hurled it in some distance. It was wedged under a log, and she was wrestling with it. She saw the sleeves of her dress catch fire and disintegrate. Fortunately, the cloth stopped burning at the armpit, or Lady Rotten would have been an inferno of velvet and lace and flesh. At last Sir Thomas, waking up to the wickedness of his action, dived down to his knees to help his wife, but he was too late. His action was unnecessary. She had somehow retrieved the heavy volume from the fireplace. She was badly burnt, terribly burnt about the arms, and scorched on the face. But it was the book that concerned her. It was the smoldering. "Get water," she cried. "Oh, please get water." Okay, so on that note, you guys, we are going to our first musical break. So on this break, we have Miss McKaylin Hay, and she is she's a talented artist from Ontario, Canada. I think she may only be like 19 or 20 years old. This girl is amazing. She's going to be singing Devil You Know, Close, and Nothing But Blood, as well as Collapse. And then we have Mr. Fred Johnson III, who is from Canyon County, California, and he will be singing Sugar. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
Your troubled heart bleeds like a river. It's rushing towards fields painted greener. It doesn't see the demons behind, praying you're getting close to the line, so they can get their hands on love and trade it off for silver. Saw you for the first time in a while. You seemed so surprised I worked out a smile. 'Cause I've grown and I've changed. Yeah, we went separate ways. How come we're both back here? 'Cause you pushed me away, had my life rearranged, but still we're both back here. Close to me, I want you close to me. I can see that you wanted me. There's too much sky, too blue, too white. The birds on the wire are singing, but I don't know why. Why aren't the roses hanging their heads? They're standing straight up, blooming instead. Now that we're apart, there's nothing but blood in my heart. Why does that guy have a smile on his face? Why is the sun even shining today? Why are the headlines talking about love? Don't they all know what happened to us? Now that we're apart, there's nothing but blood in my heart. The moon goes up, the sun goes down, the stars light up, the world goes round. Every day, life moves on, it don't stop for anyone. The moon goes up, the sun goes down, the stars light up, the world goes round. Every day, life moves on, it don't stop for anyone. Now that we're apart, there's nothing. Now that we're apart, there's nothing but blood in my heart. Ooh, blood in my heart. Ooh, blood in my heart. to inspire fondness with love. Where did our love go wrong? My sugar. Why did I make you cry? Whispers flow through my mind when I think about you. That warm feeling in me. My heart sings a sad song and just melts away. Please look into my eyes, my sugar. There's life in out there. Until the sun doesn't shine anymore, I'll be there. When time is a memory, I'll know this love. You will always be the one, my sugar. The feeling is so strong. Waiting here on this cold, lonely night without you. Where did our love go wrong, my sugar?
Oh, yeah. Try that. Yay! I think I'm back. I think I did it. For some reason, we got frozen, so I had to click on another mic setting and then go back to this mic setting. Alright, so I'm back. I'm back! Yay! Yay! Okay. Back to the story. If you couldn't hear me, which I don't think you could, I got frozen. Alrighty. So Sir Thomas, hardly knowing what he did, leapt back across the great room to where a beaker always stood. Another bound, and he was back, pouring the water over his wife. Thanks! Yay! I fixed it! Holy shnikes. I'm glad I didn't, melt down. Before I started reading again, I was talking about our awesome musical guest we have tonight. We have Miss Michaelin Hay from Ontario, Canada. And as I said before, speaking of Canada, happy Thanksgiving to my Canadian family and friends. I hope you guys are having an awesome Thanksgiving. I hope tomorrow on Thanksgiving you guys eat way too much, unless you guys celebrate it on the weekend. But I think you guys do have it on the regular day of thanks, which is tomorrow. Thanksgiving in Canada. Aw, thanks, Dennis. I'm glad you like my story time. Sometimes I feel guilty, man, am I boring these people? I'm sorry. Yeah, our guest tonight, Jeremy Catan, which is a really close friend of mine that moved from here to the East Coast. He was going to come on and talk about UFOs, but unfortunately, he got a case of the flu. But yes, happy Thanksgiving, my Canadian friends and family. So yeah, we had Miss Michaelin Hay from Ontario, Canada, and then we had Mr. Fred Johnson III from Canyon County, California. Alright, so, the name of this story, let me repeat myself again. It is The Burnt Bible of Broad Hinton. So, before we left on break, this jerk threw this lady's Bible in the fire because she hadn't made him dinner 2 hours earlier than every single freaking day before then. He just came back from hunting, and I think as his testosterone, his testes got a little violent. But yeah, he threw her Bible in the fire, and she dug in there, elbow deep, getting that big old book out of there, and then he brought her some water. Here, we're about to read. Okay, so Sir Thomas, hardly knowing what he did, leapt back across the room to where a beaker always stood. Another bound, and he was back, pouring the water over his wife. No, Thomas, no, the book. See, it's smoldering. And Sir Thomas then drenched the Holy Bible till it was a black and sodden mess. But miraculously, only the cover seemed burnt and sodden halfway, and the Holy Scripture, though scorched as if the devil half away had licked it with a fiery tongue, was hardly damaged. It was, of course, soaked, but that would right itself. Sir Thomas was now all kindness and humility, genuine kindness and humility, for as he noted earlier, he was almost as renowned for those virtues as for the less attractive attributes of the hot-tempered hunter and warrior. Lovingly, he bathed his wife's burnt arms while she winced in pain, and then, having shouted for a servant to bring cloth, he gently bandaged them up. One thing was obvious to both. Lady Rotten had cooked her last meal for several weeks. She was in great pain and heavily bandaged from above the elbow to each arm right to the fingertip. But she was no coward. She smiled. Well, the book is saved, and its safe passage through fire may be a good augury for the family of Rotten. And now, Meg, to the serving wench who had brought bandages, perhaps you had better begin the preparing of Sir Thomas's meal. It will be some time before I am able to do so. Yes, me lady. It was a polite, two-edged reply. Of course, Meg would do the cooking, and cheerfully. And of course, it would be a long time before Lady Rotten did anything of the sort herself. She would be lucky if she had any hands left. Oh, my dear one, how can you forgive me? I am a foul-tempered fool. No, Thomas, you were just hungry, that was all. You were just hungry. Sir Thomas was silent at the gentleness of the reply, silent and ashamed. That night, as they lay together, or more precisely, at some remove in their bug four-poster bed, Sir Thomas was distraught by the subdued moaning of his wife, unable to sleep for the pain. At the same time, he was noticing a most unpleasant sensation in both of his hands. They had not been burnt. The Bible had been retrieved by his brave wife before he could do so himself, but they were distinctly painful. He tried to rub one with the other to ease the pain, but that was simply agonizing. Lady Rotten stayed in bed all the following day, at her family's request, though she bravely maintained her arms felt better and that within days she would be downstairs cooking again. The 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 12 to 4, had come in for the evening meal and been duly shocked at the bandages on their mother's arms. Meg had managed a satisfactory meal, however, and after they had all washed it down with a little red wine, they retired early. But in the morning, one of the girls complained of a painful hand. Sir Thomas looked at the small, delicate hand in question. He said. "Is that all you have to offer, Father? At least you could say you were sorry my hand was hurting." "I am, my child, very sorry indeed, but the truth is that both my own hurt so much that I could hardly sleep during the night. And yet Mother's, whose hands must have been horribly burnt, says she feels no pain at all." "Your mother, child, is a very brave woman." That night, the girl's hands were both very painful indeed. As for Sir Thomas's, he hardly knew what to do with them. If they hung at his sides, the blood flowed in, as after days frostbitten hunting, so he could hardly stop himself from crying out with the pain. Any other attitude was painful, even held directly over his head. And one of the boys complained of sore hands. The physician was called in. Let us see now. "See, Father, the physician says too. Perhaps his own hands hurt." "No, young lady, my hands do not hurt. Good Sir Thomas, can one of your children or a servant bring one of your gloves?" "One of my gloves? Whatever for, man?" "I would like you to try it on, that is all." Sir Thomas roared for someone to bring a pair of his leather gauntlets, which were promptly forthcoming. The physician slipped one on his patient's hand. "But that is not my gauntlet. Why, it is far too big." "It is, Father. There are a full favorite pair." "It is as I thought, Sir Thomas. Your hands are withering." "Withering? Like leaves in autumn?" "One might liken it to the phenomenon. Try on the other glove." It was just the same. "But this is ridiculous. I am no tree. These are no leaves. Why should my hands wither?" "Only the good Lord can answer the question. Have you affronted him of late?" There was a deathly silence. "Yes," said the knight at last, "I have grievously affronted the Lord. In a moment of foolish anger, I hurled his book into the fire." "You hurled the Bible into the fire? What in God's name made you do that?" "To quote from your very words, physician, only the good Lord can answer that question. I was seized by some demon of rage, and oh God, if my wicked action was brought down harm on my lovely little daughter in addition to what is done to my wife, I shall be unable to live." The words were prophetic. The physician was now quite convinced that some law other than natural law was at work. He informed Sir Thomas that his wife's condition had improved to such an incredible extent that he believed her hands would emerge unscarred and sound from her ordeal. But as for Sir Thomas and the child, the disease was so unnatural and without apparent cause that he could only assume it was God's will. Certainly, he could hold out no hope. The next day, all 4 children were complaining of painful hands, and Sir Thomas could now very easily see that his own were shrinking to size of child's, but with the skin staying its original size, so that it hung loose, yellow, and hideous about the fingers and across the palm, like gloves made far too large. The children's, too, were withering in the same way. Each day the physician paid his visit, shook his head in dismay, and confirmed that he had no idea when or whether the shrinking, the withering, would cease. On the 4th day, Lady Rotten's bandages were off, and her hands were perfect, white and unscarred, but she was appalled at what had happened to her family while she lay upstairs, convalescing from what might have been the most serious of injuries. "Oh," she cried, looking at the youngest girl's withered hands, which were now those of an infant. "Oh, if this could but have happened to me, and not to any of you! How dreadful that 5 should suffer, and that the one who actually came in contact with the flame should recover." The physician, at the end of his tether, recommended that there should be a ceremony of exorcism, and after some difficulty, for the ecclesiastical community had been deeply shocked at the story of the near-burned Bible, a priest was made available. The solemn exorcism service, however, far from alleviating matters, seemed to make them worse. Within a week, Sir Thomas's arm had vanished halfway to the elbow, and his children's were close behind. The young ones were terrified and wept with pain and fright. Sir Thomas wept with shame. His wife wept with genuine, appalled distress. Halfway up to the elbow, the disease seemed to die out, for the arms became neatly rounded stumps. The loose skin contracted that of any preserved mummified body, and the same distressing process took place, one by one, with the 4 children. And so people could last take stock, and every man-jack in the neighborhood knew that the Lord had taken vengeance on arrogant Sir Tom Rotten, fearless knight of Broad Hinton. Sir Thomas could obviously never hunt again, but even if his hands had been spared, he would never have had the heart to do so. Slowly the rest of him withered away, though from a different cause, because the will to live no longer activated his once vibrant body. His children showed remarkable resilience, according to the parish records, being far more worried about their dying father than the fact that their own lives, however many years might stretch out ahead, had been tragically blighted. More than one shocked visitor to Broad Hinton Church has come away impressed and moved by the resourcefulness, the courage of the handicapped children through the ages, right up to and through the thalidomide tragedies of the 20th century. The children went on to lead reasonably normal lives, aided by elementary orthopedic science, spoons, pegs, knives strapped onto pitiful arms, padded, reinforced gauntlets, and other such-like items. Sir Thomas was soon dead. His heartbroken widow and grieving children erected a statue of him showing the handless arms. This now stands, as we saw at the beginning of this chapter, in the old Broad Hinton Church, proof in solid stone of something supernatural, which really must have happened. And as we have also stated, the Bible itself is there, charred, torn, and 400 years old. No man can look at it, then at the handless statue, without a strange feeling, indeed a certainty, that this is not folklore. This is fact. All right, so we are on to a new chapter. This one is called War and the Supernatural. The first story is titled Miracle of the Swamp. Ian McHorton was an eager, handsome 19-year-old second lieutenant recently commissioned in Gurkha Regiment when early in 1943 he joined the Chindits. The brainchild of Brigadier Ord Wingate, this irregular force had come into being at a time when the Japanese accompanied most of Burma and its object was to penetrate behind the enemy lines, disrupt communications, and by proving its superiority over a ruthless, jungle-wise opponent, restore British morale, badly shaken after the defeats of the previous year. In February, 7 columns depending on airdrops for their own supplies crossed the river Chindwin to face some of the worst terrain in the world. Dense jungle stretching for hundreds of miles, interspersed with huge tracts of almost impenetrable bamboo and elephant grass under a burning tropical sun. To move fast, strike suddenly, and then vanish again was the essence of the task, and so that the column would not be held up to the order was given that non-walking wounded would have to be abandoned. Not one of the men thought, of course, that this would ever happen to him. Ian's column, which was to advertise its presence and act as a decoy, struggled forward for 150 miles without mishap, till they reached a railway line which they followed towards a depot they were intending to destroy. And there the Japs ambushed them. Many were killed, and the survivors, including Ian, were ordered by radio to advance another 100 miles and contact another group from whom they would receive further instructions. But they now find themselves in a serious difficulty. Jap patrols were harrying them, and they could not use jungle tracks. Instead, they had to fight their way forward a few feet at a time, taking it in relays to hack at bamboo and dense undergrowth. After several days of this, some men went mad, while all were reduced to sweat-soaked, near-delirious skeletons. So they took the tracks again, to find on reaching the rendezvous that their friends had gone. Then they got the order, abandon heavy equipment, get out of Burma. But with the enemy closing in on them, the problem was to survive the next 24 hours. They were resting on a hilltop when the Japs attacked, and young Ian McHorton was wounded. A long, thin mortar splinter embedded itself a few inches below his left hip joint, cutting into the muscle, and he realized he could not walk. The column doctor did what he could. The colonel came to see him, and 2 friends offered to make a stretcher and carry him at the rear of the column, knowing that with such a burden they could never keep up. This offer, of course, Ian refused. So heavy-hearted, they carried him down to a shaded spot by a mortar road from where they render. Then the column moved away and left him. Alone now, in Jap-infested jungle, Ian felt terror flooding in. Then after a while, terror gave way to bitter resentment at the situation, till finally he found his mind comparatively clear. He began to think how he would give himself up when he sighted the Japs. Should he call out? Should he wait till he was found? Should he fire a shot to attract their attention? And when they found him, what would they do? Many stories he had heard of their sadistic, inhumane cruelties, their maniacal lust for blood. Would they drag him to a tree, strip him naked, bayonet him to death? Or, little more than a carcass, would he be carted off to some infamous prisoner cage in Rangoon? At these thoughts he shivered convulsively, drew his blanket tighter round him, and, too exhausted to dwell on his fears, he slept. All through the night he slept, to be woken at dawn by the noise of a motor engine approaching from the south on the road. Peering from his hollow, he saw a lorry crammed with Japanese soldiers drive past, then 2 more, then a 4th, which stopped to disgorge 10 men under an officer. Gripped with fear, Ian watched as they searched about, obviously for signs of recent made tracks. Then one of them found something and gave a shout. The officer inspected and immediately, gripping his pistol, began to climb quickly to where Ian was lying. Crashing through the undergrowth, closer and closer he came till, hypnotized, Ian registered every detail of his appearance. The drab green uniform, the riding boots, the sword dangling at his side. This was the moment. Now surely the end would come. But then the officer saw something slightly to one side of the hollow. The tracks made by Ian's friends when they left, and with a shout to his men to follow him, blind to Ian lying only 6 feet away, he swerved off in pursuit and away up the hill till all of them were lost in the jungle. Slowly, Ian relaxed a little and began to think. God, he felt, must have decreed that the Japs would pass him by. It must be a sign that he would live. Amazingly light-hearted now, he decided he would somehow teach himself to walk, and if only at the rate of 1 mile a day, cover 100 miles over the mountains into friendly China. To go with him, he chose his water bottle, hunting knife, compass, pistol, ammunition, and other necessities which he crammed into his haversack. Then, from a bamboo pole within reach of his hand, he trimmed a makeshift clutch, padding the top with a thick balaclava helmet his mother had knitted for him. Then, rolling over and using his good leg as lever, he tried to stand up, and at once collapsed in searing pain. Gradually, the pain subsided, and deciding to light a pipe, he groped in his jacket pocket for matches. There he found a poem sent in the last batch of mail against the day, as his mother had written when he might need some extra help. It was by Louise Haskins, an unknown writer till George VI had used her lines in his first Christmas broadcast of war. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, "Give me a light, and I may tread safely into the unknown." And he replied, "Go out into the darkness and into the unknown, and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than a light, and safer than a known way." Ian read the lines and reread them, in his mind a new resolution fighting with despair, till quite suddenly his doubts vanished and he was ready to do just what the poem said. He would try again to walk. 2 further attempts failed, in pain-racking nausea as miserably as the first. Then he thought up a better way of getting to his feet. The upper lip of his hollow dropped 5 feet down into a small clearing. Edging forward on his stomach, he lowered the crutch over the lip and planted it vertically on the ground. Then he inched himself back, away from the lip, into his hiding place, twisted himself painfully round, and once more shoved himself towards the lip, this time feet first. Slowly, he let himself tip over the edge, clutching a clump of bamboo firmly with his left hand till his right, sound leg was touching the ground. Then maneuvered the crutch under his left armpit, took the strain, and was standing at last. "China," he said out loud, "here I come." Paths are not frequent in the jungle, and a man might go for days without finding one. But there, miraculously behind the clearing, as a trail worn smooth by generations of barefooted tribesmen and sideways, right foot first, Ian began to climb it, where it led spiraling up the side of a hill. Though in extreme pain and weakness, he managed by nightfall to cover about 3 miles and found a place to rest. Next day, he had hauled himself to his feet by clinging to overhead creepers and was edging his way, barely conscious, along the path when 2 men suddenly loomed into view. Instantly, Ian drew his revolver and fired from the hip. Shot after shot till, still trying to fire, he collapsed into oblivion. As though transported by magic, he woke to find himself in a friendly Burman village being tended with skill by the headman. Descended by Nepalese, these villagers hated the Japs, and the headman himself had served with pride in a Gurkha regiment. This uncanny coincidence gave Ian a strange feeling of awe, for by no means every Burman village would have given him such a welcome. But that was not all. The 2 men he had fired at and fortunately missed had been Shan charcoal burners from a tribe traditionally hostile to the Japanese, and on recognizing him as a British officer, had picked him up as true Samaritans and carried him to the village. Well fed and skillfully nursed, he gathered strength in that village for a fortnight. Learning to walk with only a stick, then a messenger arrived with news that the Japs were advancing, intending to use the area as a base. The headman had warned him that the mountain passes into China were heavily guarded and escape in that direction would be impossible. There remained the westward route, crossing 300 miles of jungle, and despite the headman's pressing invitation to stay behind in the village and become one of us, Ian resolved to try it. He was given food for the journey, and the whole village saw him off with a young guide who would attempt to put him on the trail of his vanishing comrades, even still struggling, as Wingate had directed, to get out of Burma. To catch up with them would be essential, for in his present state, he could not hope to cross the rivers alone. Hobbling and in considerable pain, he was led for some days by barely visible game tracks, till one never-to-be-forgotten morning his guide suddenly bent down and called, "Come and look, Sahib!" And the soft soil, only a few hours old, were the prints of British army boots with no trace of Japanese pursuers. Greatly cheered, Ian said goodbye to his guide and followed the trail towards a broad belt of dense and suffocating elephant grass, knowing that he must somehow make his way through it and reach his friends before they crossed the broad Irrawaddy. From the tracks, he could tell that they were moving fast, but he would have to move faster, risking delirium under the torrid sun, driving himself to perhaps total collapse. He knew that there were 30 miles at least of this clawing desert, and for sustenance he had only a few handfuls of raw rice left in his pocket and half a bottle of water. It took him 3 days to cross the tangling growth of man-high, razor-sharp grasses. Plagued by thirst, flies, and the pain in his leg, he was for the most part barely conscious, and his mind was filling with nothing but dull suffering and the determination to keep going. When he staggered out of the grass belt to confront a waste of sand devoid of all vegetation, and at the sight of this blazing inferno, his resolution failed, and he fell unconscious. Reviving after a while, and tottering to his feet, he plodded on, eventually after some hours, as the heat was draining from the sun, coming to scrub, and from there to teak forest where he found water, and from there to the outskirts of a village which he recognized. Close by flowed the mighty Irrawaddy, and on a sun-bank prepared to cross the river he found his friends. "By all that's holy, look who's here," said one of them, having given him up for lost. They were in midstream in boats borrowed from the village when the Jap machine gun opened up from the riverbank ahead, bullets churning the water, whining overhead, slapping into the holes, and killing the men. In a moment, Ian's boat had capsized, and survivors were thrashing about in the water. While certain that his leg would not stand up to the 100-yard swim still remaining, he clung to an upturned side and allowed himself to be carried downstream with the boat between himself and the Japs. Slantwise, as he went, he could see some men clambering ashore and dashing for cover. Somehow, he managed to swim the last 10 yards, drag himself up the steep river bank, and find protection behind a clump of bamboo where he was joined by an unwounded man who had come ashore behind him. At that precise spot, all was quiet, but elsewhere in the gathering darkness along the river and back into the jungle, they heard the din of a running fight between groups of survivors and the enemy. Heading westwards by compass, they made away from the fight only to come on a group of wounded in a clearing who were on the point of giving up. Ian was faced with a critical decision. To slip away with his companion offered the best chance of survival. On the other hand, his duty as an officer was to intervene and saddle himself with his new command of the maimed and despairing. He decided to intervene. 10 minutes later, with new heart, the men were hoisted their packs once more. 2 were unable to walk and had to be carried on stretchers, and in that interval, 1 man had died. They went on stretchers, and they went limping westwards through thinning jungle and over flat ground, each man with only a small handful of rice, and when a village appeared ahead, they had to take the risk of encountering Japs and went in, to receive a friendly welcome and food. In the village, where the stretcher cases were left, their wounds were bound up, and with full stomachs they knew a brief contentment. But they could not wait. They had to move on, and fast, for apart from the Japs, the monsoon was now only 2 weeks ahead, and when the rains came, all rivers would become impassable. A guide from the village took them towards a railway line where they managed to avoid enemy patrols. Then for 3 days they plodded on in suffocating heat, almost foodless in a daze of near delirium, till they came to another neat little village which they had to enter, hidden Japs or no, for the sake of life itself. They were in luck once more. In that village they found their friends again, survivors from the battle by the Irrawaddy, haggard and skeletal as they all were, with some wounded, but all still able to move. They bought rice from the villagers, then took up their loads again to cross the next obstacle immediately ahead, the shallow Moo River, 200 miles or 200 yards wide. All were in cheerful mood. With a wave to Ian, "See you tonight," an officer went ahead with his men, and at that moment the surrounding jungle erupted in the zip and screech of bullets. The Jap patrol had crept up while they rested, and now was pouring in lead from machine guns and rifles. In spite of instant casualties, the scream of wounded, the jerk of dying men, there was no panic. Section by section, in extended order, the men dashed for the water, and holding their rifles over their heads, started to wade across, Ian following with his little band all still alive. Bullets furrowed the water. Here and there men tipped forward and soundlessly sank. Ahead from very shore they were struggling towards burst the din of more Jap machine guns, catching them in crossfire. Ian glanced back, but return was impossible. Gasping and floundering through the shallows, he yelled to his men, "Keep going, it's the only way." Saw the Japs taking aim from the jungle fringe farther off, flopped onto the land and found cover under the river bank. In speed now lay the choice between life and death, and soon he was up again, running full tilt from the trees, then falling, almost somersaulting over 2 Jap machine gunners hidden in the bushes. They were killed by men following behind. Then the party sped on towards teak forest, which proved sparse, offering little cover. "This way!" yelled his friends, going flat out. Ian pouring in after them. "This way!" But suddenly he could not follow. Suddenly he was laying face down on the ground with a searing pain in his right knee, and the next moment all was blackness. He awoke to find himself behind a rock attended by a single green-clad, slant-eyed, impassive soldier holding a rifle. Hypnotized, he looked at the face, and with a terrible lurch of despair knew he was a prisoner. Pistol, haversack, and belt had been taken from him, but his water bottle was within reach, and racked with thirst he took a long swig. Slightly revived, he discovered that his right trouser leg, face, beard, and shirt were soaked and covered with blood. A bullet seemed to have grazed the bone below the knee, and another had gone clean through his hat, then shattered against something, probably a stone, for his face was crisscrossed with gashes. No wound was fatal, but he had lost much blood and already half-starved, was now extremely weak. Soon he drifted into oblivion. He next found himself in a truck being driven along a motor road. Seeing him conscious, the guard laughed at him derisively, later conveying by repetition of the words that he was being taken to a village in the Chindwin River and from there would be transported to the prisoners' jail in Rangoon. The Chindwin was the dividing line between British and Japanese-held Burma. Swooning, reviving, jolting along half-conscious, Ian was past noting the passage of time. But it might have been 3 days later that the truck stopped at a small village and he was half-dragged, half-carried into a squalid hut and left on the floor while the soldier and the truck driver sat in the entrance as guards. He was now extremely frail. As night came, he fell into a strange trance-like state. Feeling he had left his body and was young and strong again, able at will to fly across the mountains to rejoin his friends. The sensation seemed so authentic that, a few moments later, when he was drawn back into the body, it was still the only reality. The frame of the bone and tattered flesh contained him seemed bound to obey his will. "I will live," he said. "I will cross the Chindwin. Nothing shall stop me now." He must have said it aloud, for one guard jerked his head up, then let it fall again and slept. In his new dream of freedom, Ian was sleeping too, till he was roused by the sound of an engine roaring outside. It was night still, and the moon was shining. Through the doorway he could see a truck standing in a small paddy field beyond the hut, with soldiers climbing in. From some distance away came a burst of machine gun fire, answered by rifles, and the next instant an authoritative voice barked out a stream of orders, and the 2 guards in the doorway ran out towards another bunch of soldiers, at that moment starting for the jungle in the direction of the firing. Now Ian was alone, though perhaps only temporarily. The paddy field, about 25 yards across and bathed in moonlight, was now deserted, and beyond that loomed the dark mass of the jungle topped by a hill. The invitation was clear and insistent. This was his moment. Feeling sustained by mysterious power, he slipped out of the hut, crossed the field, and light-footed plunged into the jungle, then started to climb the hill. He had no map, no food, no water, no compass, no weapons, but now he fully realized his good fortune. The Japs had not taken him further than his goal, but brought him nearer, closer to Chindwin. "I must reach Chindwin," he kept saying to himself, ruthlessly driving himself on, the ominous, rumbling thunder of the coming monsoon already audible beyond the mountains. For 2 days he kept going, only once finding water, till he came to an escarpment and recognized it as lying some 20 miles east of the Chind Win. 20 miles, and beyond the river, British patrols, safety, sleep. Later he wrote, I was very conscious at that moment that the hand of God was with me. But a veritable Calvary now began. The escarpment was totally arid, nothing but hot sand, rocks, and burnt-up vegetation. Yet this blinding wilderness had somehow to be crossed. Ian trudged on, trusting to instinct to lead him to the river, and like many men in desperate straits before him, he started to count his steps, each step an achievement, a triumph of will. To cover 20 miles in a day was impossible, and at some time or other night must have come, and he must have slept, but he could not remember. Later, probably on the next day, he found himself among living vegetation, then saw a stream where he bathed and drank before following it westwards. He was walking on a sandbank round a bend in the stream when suddenly he came on his companions again, no more than 20 in all. Obviously in the last stages of exhaustion, they were too tired to say more than, "Hello, Ian, you again." As they talked in desultory fashion, a water buffalo came up of the undergrowth and was shot to provide food. But the shot had altered other visitors, 2 Burmese bearing a white flag. The senior officer went forward to talk to them and came back with calamitous news. The men belonged to the BTA, or Burmese Trader Army, and behind them in the jungle was a Japanese patrol. They were giving the British 3 minutes to decide on surrender or death. It took Ian and most of the men exactly 2 minutes to absorb this news. Then they were dashing headlong for the west bank of the stream, where there was dense cover. Most, including Ian, got ashore with bullets whining amongst them and eventually came to a clearing where they slept the night before, splitting into small groups. All right, so let's stop there. Hopefully, let's see. Hopefully I can find my way back to this. Okay, small groups. Where's it at? Okay. Splitting into small groups to cover the last most dangerous few miles to the Chind Win. All right, let me put this line here. All right, so we're off to another awesome musical break. On this break, we have Miss Michaelan Hay from Ontario, Canada. She's going to be singing Pins and Needles, Mirror, as well as Gravity. Then we have Mr. Fred Johnson III with After Dark, and he is from Canyon County, California. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
Talking on pins and needles, every word through a microscope. You keep stomping down on the ground while I've been stuck on this tightrope. I just wanna say what I wanna say without your sentence. I'm not willing to do the time when I'm innocent, and I'm innocent. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Walked on my share of thin ice with your blowtorch at my feet. You won't ever see me beg, so take this tongue off your leash. I'm gonna say what I wanna say, don't need talking on pins and needles, talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Dancing on shattered glass, kicking the pieces all around. My safety has been broken. This is now a hunting ground. Talking on pins and needles, talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up, and I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, up, up. Talking about, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, up, up. Talking about, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, up, up. Talking about, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, I'm gonna hang it up, 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 up. I dove right in, didn't bring a parachute, fell right through, hit the water hard, moving too fast, spiraling out of control, was touch and go, went a little far. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep your shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar, scar, scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. Try to erase the ink that's left upon my chest. I'll attest, I don't really wanna forget to forget. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep your shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar, scar, scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through just waiting for the moment we I feel you pull me closer. You got me burning up. You got a hold on me. I feel you pull me closer. You got me burning up. Your mind, my gravity. I feel you pull me closer. You got me burning up. You got a hold on me. I feel you pull me closer. You got me burning up. Your mind, my gravity.
My driver pulls up in my limousine, ready to take me anywhere I want to be. I said, I want to go. Take me to a college scene. I'd like to go and dance, have drinks, and hunt the perfect date. Yeah. Living at the door, I search lonely streets to find hidden shadows in the dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Secret homicides arranged in a series of pursuits. No matter what I say, after dark. I gave her base because she had the range. I knew she was the one that never could go home again. Plastic light by limo seats. I don't know why I can't control this urge to hurt again. Yeah. Living at the door, I search lonely streets to find hidden shadows in the dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Changes in the sky, murder forever after. No matter what I say, after dark. Feeling ran to arguments and fear. In hiding place with days of December. Concerning words or meshed in romantic. It doesn't matter what I say. It really doesn't. No matter what I say, after dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Secret homicides arranged in a series of pursuits. No matter what I say, changes in the sky, murder forever after. It doesn't matter what I say. Brooding fatal, lacking the hint of conscience. No matter what I say, after dark.
Not time for that yet. I had it on auto DJ, so it just took off. But welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I want to say thank you to our musical host, Mr. Roy Washington, for providing us with all of this amazing music. I don't know what we would do without him, but I'm so grateful that we have music instead of those damn blasted commercials. So, I also want to say happy Thanksgiving to all of my Canadian friends and family out there. I hope you guys are having a wonderful time with your family and this motherfucking Rona ain't getting you down. I know Sister Sandra's over there cooking some very amazing things. I had to go on break and grab myself a chicken sandwich and a couple pepperoncinis on the side. Wash it down with some Voodoo Ranger Imperial IPA. My nose is a little sniffly now after those pepperoncinis. And I know I'm going to be paying for it later. I know better than to eat such things, but it's so good. I can't help it. All right. So back to our story. Miracle of the Swamp. Alright, so it took Ian and most of the men exactly 2 minutes to absorb this news. Then they were dashing headlong for the west bank of the stream, where there was dense cover. Most, including Ian, got ashore with bullets winning amongst them and eventually came to a clearing where they slept the night before, splitting into small groups to cover the last and most dangerous few miles to the Chindwin. That afternoon, Ian was on the east bank of the river, like some modern Moses viewing the Promised Land. At once he prepared to swim across, accepting a pair of water wings from a friend who intended to search for a boat. With his hat on his head and his boots tied together round his neck, he waded in and soon was performing a sluggish breaststroke, till the current caught him and carried him towards the west bank at a bend in the river, where he waded ashore and at last flopped down on British-held territory. But the end was not yet. Ian had climbed to his feet again and was happily crossing a paddy field when there came the crack of an unseen rifle and a bullet smacked into the heel of his right boot, throwing him over backwards into a bush. The unexpectedness of the attack just when he felt safe filled him with rage, which grew no less when he saw that not a Jap but a Sikh, a traitor civilian, was pursuing him. As the man lopped from the undergrowth, he formed a murderous resolve. With no pistol now, he looked round desperately for a weapon and found he was almost kneeling on a broken branch from a teak tree. He seized it with both hands, and as the Sikh ran up searching for him, brought the heavy wood crashing down on his skull. There was a horrible crunch, and the Sikh fell without a groan. Ian slid the curving knife from the cummerbund, but could not bring himself to take the rifle still gripped in the lifeless hands. Then he staggered on westwards. He had water, but could not remember when he had last eaten. The bullet had grazed his Achilles tendon, and walking mostly on open under a pitiless sun was agony. Nightfall brought him to a river, which at first he took for the River Ewe, a smaller stream well within the British territory. Then he recognized the Chindwin. He had been walking all day in a circle. He slept that night on the river bank, too dejected to stir. But with the draw and with the dawn, he felt refreshed and set out westwards again, resolved this time to make no mistakes. It was fortunate that in a deserted village a young python came his way. He was so hungry by now that he had no hesitation in killing it, cooking portions in a pot which he found, and eating python steak. To him it tasted delicious. He walked for 2 more days through the jungle and paddy fields, and was alarmed to find that not even food could do much for him now. What he needed, and had to have soon, was weeks of total rest. Meanwhile, he had sighted no British patrols, and he was still alone. But next morning, something within him still drove him westward, lucid only in brief snatches, till towards sunset he found himself in a swamp. It was a sinister place, with great shadows looming under the red rays of dying sun, a fetid atmosphere, and great stretches of stagnant water and oozing, treacherous mud. What looked like avenues of undergrowth led in different directions, but none led out of the swamp. He splashed about, clung to branches to prevent himself from falling, and felt terror climbing in him. He was irretrievably lost. In that dreadful situation, one decision imposed itself. With darkness falling, he would have to spend the night where he was, and fortunately, there were some mud banks rising out of the water, solid enough to support him. On one of these he slept. At dawn, he found that in trying to get out of the swamp, he had lost his boots. But he hardly cared about that. He staggered to his feet again, but had only gone a few steps when he collapsed unconscious in another mud bank. When he recovered, there was an interval of clear-headedness in which, in the teeth of facts, he felt curiously confident that he was going to win through. Without moving, he turned his eyes to the left and came face to face with a lizard. At sight of him, it scampered away along the smooth mud bank, stumbling slightly in a shallow depression near the middle, then vanishing into the undergrowth. Ian's eyes were now riveted on the depression, which otherwise he might not have seen. It seemed to have an outline of a boot. He crawled over, and now he was examining it closely. It was a boot print indeed, with 13 stud marks of a British Army standard-issue ammunition boot. Moreover, the print was recent. The man, whoever he was, had certainly not been there for long during the sunlight. Where the heck did I go? I lost my place. Let's see. Alright, so he crawled over and now he was examining it closely. It was a boot print indeed. 13 stud marks. Moreover, the print was recent. The man, whoever he was, had certainly not been there in strong sunlight. Otherwise, the minute piles of earth behind each stud mark would have crumbled and broken down. Moreover, and even stranger, there were more prints, as he could now see, leading dead straight and diagonally across the mud bank. But they started at that spot where the lizard had stumbled, yet there was not the faintest scratch or disturbance to show how the man had got there. But what did that matter to Ian? They were a track, and in the word of the poem broadcast by George VI, they were safer than a known way, and he would follow them unquestionably. In utter faith, Ian followed the boot prints, and they never let him down. Skirting deep pools and treacherous mud, they took him from one patch of firm ground to another, till at last, after many minutes, the swamp petered out, and he was on solid earth. There he had to rest, for he was very weak. He leaned back against a tree facing the swamp he had crossed and took a long swig from his water bottle. Putting it down beside a boot print just behind him, then he looked out ruminatively over the swamp. What a relief to have got clear of that sinister morass. Then he looked again, and again looked with growing amazement. He could see clearly the marks of his own feet as they crossed the nearest mud bank, but the boot prints had vanished. Was this some trick of the mind? To make sure, he retraced his steps for over 100 yards, well back into the swamp, following his own footmarks, but the boot prints, there was not the slightest sign. In the presence of this mystery, which he knew he could not solve, he felt profound amazement, but no fear. I will follow, and you will lead. Such was the thought that came to his mind, and he then went boldly forward, following the prints up hills, along jungle tracks, across paddy fields, light-heartedly singing and laughing with a glorious sense of companionship. He reached the edge of the stream, and there the prince abruptly ceased. But before he could feel anxiety, he heard the sound of water flowing ahead, and in a few minutes he had emerged onto a beach of silver-white sand bordering a river, the River Yu lying many miles west of the Chinwen. Collapsing under the sudden heat of the sun, he lay blissfully in the shadows, looking out towards the jungle in the opposite bank. When suddenly some men with rifles and bayonets came out from the shadows wearing green uniforms and soft peaked caps, and his world collapsed in ruins. Only Japs wore clothing like that. So, the Japs had crossed the Chinwen and this river as well, and now must have advanced into India itself. Once more, hundreds of miles of perilous jungle lay between Ian and safety. Week after week of dodging enemy patrols, that prospect finally and irrevocably he could not face. Slowly he rose from the shallows, drew the Sikh knife and dropped it on the sand and held up his hands. With total fatalism, he stared at the men now crossing the river. One of them raised his rifle, aiming at Ian. He saw an ugly glint of sunlight at the end of the muzzle. At any moment now, the man would fire. The man would fire. And now, the horizontal river and the jungle beyond were swinging up towards the sky. And back again. And the sun with its blinding glare was suddenly moving with the speed of a shooting star. The darkness overwhelmed him. When Ian awoke, it was night, and he was lying on his back beside a campfire in a jungle clearing surrounded by armed men. Someone handed him a mug of tea. The men were British soldiers recently issued with jungle green uniforms and had been crossing the Yu on a reconnaissance patrol when he had risen unexpectedly from the shallows. Later he learnt that British troops had been east of the river for many weeks and that patrol had been the only way and the only one within 100 square miles. With the reaction beginning to work in him, feeling terribly weak and ill, he was taken by ambulance to main headquarters at Imphal, on the way hearing the first downpour of the delayed monsoon, and put into a spotless and almost empty hospital. And there, as he slowly recovered, he began to think. He thought first of all those friends who had not come back, but had died somewhere lost in the jungle, starved or shot, or even now were dying as prisoners of the Japs, and he mourned for them and ached for their young lives lost. Then he thought of the extraordinary strokes of fortune which had helped him through, and the ordinary strokes, and more he thought, the more certain he became. He had been saved, and he now had an obligation to the power that had saved him. What then should he do? What was now required of him? He could not tell. He was in darkness again, as the poem said, at the beginning of another year or stage in his life. So once again he must put his hand into the hand of God, and then follow the new path wherever it might lead. That was his obligation to God, and to his friends, and to the living, and to the dead. So this next story is called The Colonel's Strange Game of Billiards. There are many people, officers of standing, who were in the mass that night and prepared to vouch for the truth of the Colonel's story. There are many others, including myself, who at the same house during the war encountered the same apparition. I am, therefore, completely convinced of the truth of the incidents which I now relate. But there are still people living to whom the story, being a dreadful family one, causes great distress, and because of this I have felt obliged to change the setting by an English county or two and the names of all involved. But if you are old enough and, as we old gunners maintain, fortunate enough to have served in the Royal Artillery during the 1939 war, you may well recognize the details of tragedy within the next few lines. It was in 1943 that Lieutenant Colonel Savage was posted to take command of a regiment of field artillery stationed in Kent. That is to say, 3 batteries, each armed with 8 25-pounder guns. Like so much wartime accommodation for a vastly augmented army, Kirkham Place was a large house set in some 50 acres of lovely Kentish land. It had been requisitioned by the Army and the 438th Field Regiment, R.A., whereby no means its 1st Artillery Tenants. The 438th had distinguished themselves in the North American campaign, suffering in the process many casualties, including the loss to a German sniper's bullet of their much-loved commander officer. So it was with some trepidation that Lieutenant Colonel Henry Savage was driven from Folkestone railway station, the 10 miles or so inland to Kirkham Place. He knew from past experience as a more junior officer just how unloved was the new broom sent to take charge. He had, of course, no intention of being any such thing, particularly under such sad circumstances as these. He expected to be treated with courteous reserve by the majority of the officers he had been sent to command, with barely concealed hostility from others, and by gushing delight from those who hoped to gain speedy promotion when the new CO had settled in and sorted out friend from foe. All this Colonel Savage had experience of, and although it was an honor to be translated from acting CO of a training regiment on Salisbury Plain to a very real CO of a distinguished fighting regiment which was being refitted and brought up the strength for the beaches of Normandy, he had that familiar feeling of butterflies in the stomach as the jeep turned into a long, long avenue of elms. "It's air, sir," said the driver brightly. "Not a bad little old, really. 'Cause you're their Alameen. A battery guns is in the field there, and the guns of B battery, they're kept in the copse behind. And you, sir, have 8 guns of C. Battery more or less, as a personal bodyguard, sir, as it was found convenient to have them dotted round the garden. Not much of a garden now, sir, with them quad tractors dragging great guns across the beds, but it must have been, well, very salubrious once." "I see," said Savage, "and the guns are all out today." "That's right, sir, a scheme. And Regimental HQ is in the big house with the offices, RHQ mess, C battery mess, and all that. That's right, sir, and this is such a ruddy big estate that the officers, NCOs, and men of the other 2 batteries are all very comfortable in other gardeners' and foresters' houses here and there." They had arrived, and the driver put on his brakes in mid-sentence, flinging up a spray of the once lovely gravel which had covered the whole of the mile-long drive, and they turned round in the front of the beautiful old house, which was now to be his regimental office and his headquarters mess. The assistant adjutant appeared, a very young man with 1 pip on each shoulder, and greeted the new CO. He seemed a nice sort of chap, neither servile nor hostile, and he confirmed that the entire regiment was out on a maneuver led by the 2 IC, all 24 guns with their retinue of R trucks G trucks, M and T trucks, motorbikes, theodolites, and the rest of it were out dealing with some imaginary enemy swarming over Kent and Sussex. Savage was familiar with this sort of thing, and he grinned as he pictured the battle in which the enemy only manifested itself in the form of a sweating staff officers on motorbikes. "They're still advancing," a typical one would gasp out, "and their leading elements have reached this area here," pointing with a grubby, multicolored finger which he'd been using all day to rub off chinograph crayon markings from the celluloid board. "The Loamshires are putting in a counterattack, and their CO will be along in the moment. Fancy he'll be wanting a barrage." And the staff officer would be off. Sometimes, if he had a sense of humor, he might grin and mutter, "God, what a way to fight a war," before he vanished in a blue cloud of exhaust. It had been late afternoon by the time Savage arrived at his new ham, this young assistant adjutant, that the regiment would not be back before 22 hours and would have had their evening meal before then. So, at least as far as Savage could gather, it would be just himself and his ac-adj sharing a lonely meal in a banqueting hall where generations of Kirkhams had fed themselves and their guests, and more recently, the officers of units going back before the arrival of 438th they had tried to follow. It was a lovely house, largely Jacobean. The family portraits had, of course, been taken away for the duration, and the marks were clear to see. And their place had been taken by Peter Scott Wilful and occasionally Chilly Nude. The whole house was chilly, which was hardly surprising, as there wasn't a yard of carpet left. That, too, had been stored. And the great yawning fireplaces, bereft of logs, were fringed with unlit paraffin heaters. And yet it was August, and really, there should be no cause for this rather upsetting chill. Outside, the sun was still up, and the day had been a scorcher. Henry was introduced to his Batman, Higgins, who thoughtfully ran him a tepid bath. The colonel got through this ordeal as quickly as possible, dried himself in fervor to warm himself up, and slipped into fresh underclothes, socks, and shirt, which Higgins slipped and had put out on his bedroll. After these clean items, Savage put on the same battle dress tunic and trousers he'd been wearing all day. He could have put on the smarter khaki service dress he possessed, but decided to greet his returning warriors later on that evening dressed like one of them. It was true, though, that he missed the days of peace and the main RA mess at Woolwich, where no officer and gentleman would dream of sitting down to the evening meal without his blue patrols. With their tight blue trousers and their high choker collars, sometimes on greater occasions it was full mess kit, but Savage's blue patrols and his mess kit were packed away somewhere he wasn't sure he even remembered where. It hardly mattered. He didn't really expect to see this war out, or have a chance to wear any of that clobber again. And so it came as quite a surprise when, clean inside and not so clean on the surface, he made his way down the beautiful, uncarpeted spiral staircase to do a little private reconnaissance of the premises, and found himself face to face at the bathroom of the stair with a very smartly dressed young officer with a rather comical drooping blonde mustache, and the man, sporting only one pipe in each shoulder, wore impeccable blue patrols. There was the high choker collar, with just a suspicion of the stiff, rather clerical white one, which had to be changed after every wearing. The slim-fitting blue jacket, with its silver buttons, the skin-tight blue pantaloons with the wide red band hip to ankle, worn over knee-length, paper-thin, spurred boots, which had to be inserted and strapped into these trousers before one limberly climbed in from the top. Henry Savage had never paid a great deal of attention to sartorial details, so he was unable to put a finger on the few small points in which this officer's blue patrols differed from his own, back in that tin trunk somewhere. 2 things were certain. The uniform was quite an old one, of a better material than today's, and the officer had a far better tailor than Henry Savage's. That's right," said Savage. "Good evening." The young man did not volunteer his own name, and Savage assumed that the arrival of the assistant adjutant for dinner would clear matters up. No doubt there was some good reason for this smart young officer not being out on the scheme. Perhaps he was a guest from some other artillery unit, in which case it seemed a rather odd night to invite the poor fellow. "Like a game of billiards?" said young man. "Why, yes, I really would like a game of billiards. You must forgive me. I don't know my way round here yet. I'd no idea there was a billiard table." "Oh, yes," said the young man. "We've always had a billiards table." He looked over at the hideous tin clock on the mantelpiece, obviously standing in there for some priceless Armolu creation which the house owners had wisely stored away with everything else. "Yes," he said, "we'll just have time for a game before your dinner." This remark struck Henry Savage as a most unusual one, and a few hours later, when his officers had returned from their maneuvers, he was talking with them over a glass of whiskey. He had occasion to remember the remark which immediately preceded it as well. But for the moment, everything was driven from his mind by the splendor of the room into which he was now ushered. It was true that even here the family portraits had been removed, but the pictures which took their place were attractive, well-framed, suitable as if the family had substituted them with some care before handing over their precious house. The real beauty of the room for Savage lay in the enormous and superb billiard table which occupied 2/3 of the floor space. Here was something which the family had chosen not to dismantle, and here it stayed like a wonderful ornate throne in an almost empty palace. Along the whole of one wall was an ebony rack with billiard cues, enough for the whole officers' mess to indulge in the sacrilege of football billiards, or something of the sort. Something, thought Henry Savage, with a solemnity approaching the devout which he most certainly would not permit. His young friend made a little half-bow and a wave towards the armory of cues. The Savage selected one and carefully chalked it. In a moment they were playing, and a rattling good game it was, too. They seemed evenly matched, though Savage once or twice wondered whether the young man wasn't missing the odd shot in deference to the C.O.'s rank. Eventually Savage won, but only by the narrowest of margins. There was the sound of the dinner gong, and he smiled to himself. Every officer but the standard T-boy out on some frightful maneuver, and here not only a priceless billiard table and fixings, but of all things a dinner gong too? "Sounds like dinner," said the young subaltern in blues. "Thank you for the game." "I enjoyed it very much," said Colonel Savage, watching in some puzzlement as his recent adversary opened the billiard room door and went out, closing it behind him. Still no sign of the the assistant adjutant, but just as Savage was wondering if the whole thing were a dream, and he was in a totally uninhabited house with Mess Bordier, came in. "Assistant Adjunct Mr. Perkins sends his compliments, sir, but he's had to dash off on one of D.R.'s motorbikes, sir. Seems the adjutant himself had a little accident, and Mr. Perkins has to take over the duty." "Dear me," said Savage. "I wonder if I ought to go myself." Mr. Perkins, Lieutenant Perkins, sir, he said you weren't to worry, and he was ever so sorry you'd have to have your first meal all alone. Like, I'll just show you the way, sir." Under the circumstances, Savage had no heart to ask what had happened to the young man with whom he had just finished a game of billiards. He allowed the bombardier to lead him from billiard room via anteroom to mess. An uncomfortable chair was pulled out, and he sat down. Dinner was surprisingly good, including even a half bottle of white wine, but the meal and the minor emergency involving the adjutant as his new regiment could not drive the nagging question from Henry Savage's mind. 2 or 3 times he was about to ask the mess bombardier what had happened to the officer in blue patrols, and the same number of times he let the matter rest. After dinner, being all alone, he wandered back to the billiard room and switched on all the lights. It was a beautiful room, and Savage wondered appreciatively about it. Then he saw the stain. It was a black stain running the whole way down the wooden paneled wall from the roughly 6 feet up the floor level and then spreading out over the parquet. It was a very big stain indeed, and instinctively Henry Savage knew it had been blood. A minor pandemonium announced that the maneuvers were ended and his officers were back. He felt strangely ill at ease, and it was not just the ordeal of confronting these younger men who had come back from what had probably been a hellish day. It was this damn house, the stain, the billiard player. Soon, the problems of the introduction were under control. The second in command, a great gangling major of about 30 with an engaging personality, soon had everyone sitting happily around a real fire, which he himself lit in the enormous fireplace in the anteroom. Drinks circulated, and the muddy, happy young officers who had just defeated the enemy chatted gaily with their new CO. After the second glass of whiskey, Henry Savage plucked up the courage to ask his silly question. There was a convenient hush, and then he filled it with words. "I suppose this is an absurd question, but when I came down to dinner all by myself, I met a subaltern in blues. And when we had a game of billiards together, which he kindly let me win, since which I haven't clapped my eyes on him. Just who is he?" There was a long pause. Then the second in command spoke. "Well, sir, in a nutshell, that's the ghost of Cookham." "Tell me more. Nothing would surprise me now." "Well, let's see. It's only 11:30. I don't think Bateson will have hit the sack yet." "No, of course he won't." "Well, get him to tell us all the story, because 1 or 2 of the younger officers haven't met our ghost or heard his story, not yet." Fine. Who's Bateson?" "The old family butler, the Kirkham family's butler, way up in his 70s, and although we like to persuade him out in his butler-ing kit for the mess nights, he's a retiring sort of chap and contents himself with being the best damn cook in Kent. We sort of took him over the house, and the officers from all the units since 1939, when the place was requisitioned, have been chipping in to keep him on, so I don't suppose Bateson's left Kirkham Place since he was a young footman in the Victorian days. John, just pop out and see if you can persuade him to come and join us in a glass or something." The young officer jumped to his feet and clumped out in a very muddy pair of boots. "He was terribly, tangible for a ghost," said Savage. "No white sheets, no transparency." "That's quite right, he's solid when he's around, but honestly, sir, I don't think you'll see him again. He turns up, comes back, when someone new arrives, and not always then, and you can wave all your magic wands, mutter all your incantations, but you're not likely to clap eyes on him again." "Have you seen him?" "Yes, sir, I have. I arrived alone, like yourself, and I suppose there's 6 other chaps in this room. Come on, quick show of hands, thanks." Yes, 5 or 6 chaps who've seen him simply because he came on them when they were alone. You see, he's not exactly gregarious. A portly figure who could only have been an English butler in his middle 70s was let in. His uniform of blue shirt and crumpled flannel trousers could not distinguish his calling. Hello, Bateson, sir. This is Mr. Bateson, Colonel Savage. Glass of whiskey? Good, sit yourself down. The two IC poured a large whiskey, added a drop of water, and handed it over. Yeah, make sure you water it down there, Sparky. We don't want to get too willy-nilly. Your very good health, gentlemen, and in particular to our new commanding officer. Thank you, said Henry Savage. I gather, sir, said Bateson, crossing one leg over the other and relaxing, that you'd met Lieutenant Kirkham, Sir Nigel Kirkham. So I have been told. We played billiards, and then he just vanished. Yes, sir, he always does. Well, it's a very sad story. Sir Nigel was 22 when his father was killed in the war. The last war, that is, sir, the 1914 one. And Nigel, and how I admired that young man, inherited the baronetcy. But he was terribly sick, and he had been sick all his life. Tuberculosis, TB it was. They wouldn't let him into the army, not him, with a chest like that. He had to stay here looking after the family interests. When he was well enough, and oh, how that spirited boy hated that. And this was while his father, Sir Arthur Kirkham, went off to the Flanders, and there he was killed, beginning of 15 it was. And Nigel, Sir Nigel, as he'd suddenly become determined to revenge him, so he managed to fiddle his medical exam. No, I've no idea how he did it, him sometimes coughing blood and all that, but he did, and the next thing we knew, I was butler even then, at Kirkham. Next thing we knew, he was all dressed up in khaki and heading for Lord Kitchener in those trenches. But it didn't work, starting really vomiting blood, even before he got to Flanders. An Aldershot it was. So he was re-examined, the M.O. who'd passed him got a real roasting, and back he came to Kirkham. Bateson graciously accepted a second whiskey. Thank you, sir. Well, this, as far as young Master Nigel was concerned, and I still think of him as that, even though he was a baronet, this was the end, so he did just what I always said he'd do. The silence could be felt. No one breathed. Anyone who really knew the boy could have predicted it. You all know the billiard room, gentlemen, and the key rack. Well, there used to be a gun rack there on the wall, with all sorts of rifles and shotguns and things. So he merely took a pistol, loaded it, and put the muzzle to his mouth. Standing up against the wall he was. Just blew the back of his head clean out, and the stain, well, that terrible, horrible blood stain, it never went. You gentlemen have all seen it. And Lady Kirkham and the young sisters, they were all heartbroken, and they tried again and again, and with me too, of course, to get the huge stain off, but it stayed exactly the same over all these years. No, thank you, sir. I won't, if you don't mind. Must tidy up the kitchen and get a bit of shut-eye at my age. Bateson got up. So that's the story, gentlemen, and I've always felt bitter that they never let him go and do his bit in Flanders before death got him one way or the other. It was rather like a king declaring an audience over, and Sir Nigel hasn't left the house. He'll never leave Kirkham. He fixed a not unfriendly look on Henry Savage. I'll tell you one thing, because he couldn't do all the outdoor things he wanted, he became unbeatable at billiards. Never ever lost from the age of 14, unless, that is, he was being nice to someone. Nobody ever beats Master Nigel at billiards unless he wants to be polite, because they've just arrived. Bateson went over to the door, preparatory to make his exit. So that's what I always say. That's the reason no one ever meets him twice at the billiard table. Master Nigel was a great fighter. He'd let you have one game because you were new, but his natural fighter's instincts, they wouldn't let him lose a second time. So he must just saves himself the temptation. Good night, gentlemen. So we've made it to yet another chapter. So this chapter is known as Ghost Benevolent. Oh my. So maybe we can read a little bit of this, but then, unfortunately, we will have to go our own ways. Hello, Mr. Moon. Good to see you. Alright, so this next story is called The Tennis Coach. It's strange in a way, although I have known Maurice Pettigrew for nearly 40 years, ever since we were at Oxford, and although I have seen a great deal of him at home, in the city, and in the club throughout the whole of that period, not devoted to the fighting or respective wars in Burma, and in Bombay Command, it is only during the last few years, I feel now, that I have really known him at all. Others, of course, have noticed and wondered at the change in Pettigrew, but I am alone, or so I believe, in knowing how that change was brought about. Not because I was especially chosen as his confidant, but simply and fortuitously because some years ago he accepted the use of my villa in Spain for a convalescent holiday following a slight cardiac crisis brought upon him by the overzealous involvement in too many boardroom battles. Both the involvement and the crisis it precipitated were entirely in keeping with the character of Pettigrew as we had always known him. He was the sort of man who is always involved in something, and it was simply not in his nature to treat any matter lightly. Only son of a northern industrialist, wealthy rather than rich, the first of his family to climb the steep wall of life on the Oundle-Oxford ladder, he was born a pragmatist, determined from the start that his natural attributes should outweigh his natural limitations. So that's the beginning of that story. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to reread this next time we have story time. I don't know if we're going to do this on Halloween. Like I said earlier, I really want to do like a Halloween party with perhaps Mr. Moon, Mr. Dennis, Miss Sandra, maybe J-Toe, whoever would like to join me for a Halloween gathering on All Hallows Eve on the 31st of October. I would just really, really, really love to do that. That to me would be amazing. So yeah, you guys, let me know in Messenger or email or whatnot if you would like to join me for the Halloween after party. I think the max amount of numbers we will have is maybe 4 to 5, because if you have more than that, it's just really a mess as far as everybody getting to talk and not talking over each other and, things that really piss people off sometimes. Like, I'm all good with it. I can sit there and listen to people forever, especially if you have a cool, Canadian accent, or you're from Wisconsin and, you like cheese. But you guys, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for story time with me, TessaTNT, on Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure reading to you all, and I want to thank all of my friends on We Are Paradox Media's KPNL Radio, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time, and I can't wait to do it again next weekend. Alright, so the 16th is open. If you guys know anybody that has, a really epic good guest that we can have, I don't know why Moon said 666. But if you have a good guest that you would like for me to have on National Boss Day, which is the 16th, that'd be great. On the 17th, we have Mr. Fortrone, and we're going to be discussing UFOs, supernatural, the paranormal, ghost stories, haunting, etc., etc. It's going to be awesome. So you guys, don't forget, we are all in this together. Together, we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. If you'd like to join us for the Skype after party, give me a jingle jangle at 970-335-9596, or look me up under Tessa.N.Thomas30, or I believe it's Tessa Thomas-Peterson, and you'll see me there in my cowgirl hat. But until next time, nighty night, love and light. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening. I hope you don't work too hard this week, and I hope to see you back here next weekend. I'd like to once again thank our musical sponsor, Mr. Roy Washington, and then all of our patrons, Mr. Jim Morris of the Scottish Isles, Del Elson, Kevin McDougall, and Miss Mia Savage. You guys take care of my ears. See you next time.